So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you've joined us for Dana Tomlin, a celebration of life visualizing complex information. We have an absolutely incredible group of speakers with us today who will offer their individual assessments of Dana's impact, both here at Penn and very far beyond. They have decades of experience working with Dana, collaborating with and learning from him. And I'm grateful to them for being here today. For my part, when I began my teaching career, Dana was already a legend. I mean, I learned about his work when he was teaching at Ohio State when I became a faculty member back in the late 1970s. And his reputation as an original thinker and generous mentor preceded him. It was abundantly clear that he was reshaping the practices of landscape architecture and environmental planning and professions beyond landscape architecture and planning. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Anne Whiston Spirn. Anne is the Cecil and Ida Green Distinguished Professor of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she teaches courses in ecological urbanism, landscape literacy, and photography as a form of inquiry. She's the author of 4 very marvelous and influential books, including The Granite Garden, The Language of Landscape, Daring to Look, and The Eye is the Door. The Eye is the Door. In 2018, Anne won the National Design Award and the Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Medal from the International Federation of Landscape Architects. And in 2020, the American Society of Landscape Architects presented her with the ASLA Gold Medal. Like me, she has deep roots here at Penn. After earning her MLA at Penn, she taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design for 7 years, then succeeded Ian McHarg as the chairman of the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. Thank you, Anne.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to see folks here. Hi, Dana. Very happy to honor you today. And I see Sam Tomlin's on too. Hey, Sam, it's been too long. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to express my appreciation for Dana Tomlin, whose qualities of heart and mind I admire so much. Dana and I started out together in 1979 as assistant professors at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. We taught the first year required studio and landscape planning together. Prior to producing plans, however, the students had to develop suitability and evaluation models, which were coded on punch cards and turned in as a deck of cards to the Harvard Computer Center so that the mainframe computer could generate the computer maps. And I didn't know anything about computers at this point. We were using Dana's map analysis package, which was a pioneering GIS program, which he created. Now, I know Dana, therefore, as both a teacher and a colleague because he kept me one step ahead of the students on what I needed to know in order to teach them. And one quality that I really appreciated and valued in these sessions was his incredible patience. Co-teaching with Dana was scary. As a novice teacher, I felt I had to plan everything down to the last detail and feel I would had to be in control, or otherwise I just feared there'd be chaos. But tying Dana down to a detailed plan for each class was impossible. we'd agree on a framework, more or less, then he would improvise. For example, we were teaching a group of about 45 students who were very grumpy about using the computer. They were landscape architecture students, drawn from architecture and BLAs, and as well as 3-year students. But they really, this idea of working with the computer was not really what they wanted to be doing, most of them. And so in this class, what I'm referring to of where I was really blown away was when we were asking them we were telling them about what we were going to do next, which was to develop some suitability models. And so there were the standard kinds of, Dana and I talked about the standard sort of models like water quality or transportation or whatever. But Dana walked up to the blackboard and said to the class, well, what suitability models do you think we should be doing for this proposed development, mixed use development? And he stood up there at the blackboard and just took whatever suggestions the students said. And he filled up this entire wall of blackboard with all of these disparate notions of the things that one should be using to help design and then later to do evaluation models from. And I thought, my God, where is he going to go? How's he going to make anything of this? And then one student yelled out, aesthetic quality. We want a model for aesthetic quality. Well, figuring out how to code aesthetic quality would be quite a challenge. But the students had come up with this one student had come up with it, and there was a cadre of students who were really interested in it, and it was their own idea, so they owned it. And it was probably the hardest suitability model to develop, but they had proposed it, they owned it. And then I watched as Dana took this blackboard full of about 50 terms and helped the students collapse it down to about 10. And it was, I was really just in awe watching this. I was in awe of his teaching style. It was like I was watching a high wire act with a performer working without a net. But in fact, I realized later that Dana was working with a safety net because he trusted his students, and the students were the safety net. And as a result of his methods of opening up and letting the students develop this array of features to look at, he made room for the unorthodox. In this case, the team that wanted to do aesthetic quality, and the unexpected. It took me some years to have the self-confidence to adopt Dana's methods of teaching, but I now would no longer dream of dictating to my students, and the results are transformative. And I owe that to Dana's example. The more I learned about the map analysis package that first year, the more I appreciated its brilliance. It gave names to planning and design moves that I had used in practice, but I'd never had word for. I didn't have a name for them. And being able to name them meant that you could use them more intelligently and deliberately. This was truly the work of a designer rather than a geographer, for example, or someone in geoscience. It also included operations that a designer would want, such as what can be seen from any point in a landscape, given the topography. Dana's undergraduate degree is in landscape architecture from the University of Virginia. And I was not surprised when I once met his former professor, who was the previous chair at UVA, when he told me that Dana was one of the most talented designers that had graduated from the UVA undergraduate program. I regard Dana as the Richard Feynman of our field. Feynman, a great physicist, worked visually first, mapping out theory in diagrams, then working out the numbers later. So for me, Dana is a designer and a really great visual thinker. Another quality is Dana's fundamental generosity. Scores of students and colleagues have experienced this on a personal level, but Dana, on a global level, gave away his ideas freely. I remember when we were assistant professors, him packing up these packages to send all over the world, because for the price of postage and a disk, he would send the map analysis package software to anyone who asked. He believed in open access before there was even a term. I have long been struck by Dana's humility. And by humility here, I mean a freedom from arrogance. He knows his worth, but he doesn't brag about it or call attention to it. After I managed to recruit Dana to Penn, I met a professor from civil engineering. When he learned I was in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning, he expressed his awe that we had managed to attract Dana to Penn. He's a legend, he said. My colleagues in the department at that time, I think, had no idea at that point of Dana's standing. They were used to a more bombastic style, and Dana's humility was deceptive. Patience, improvisation, unorthodox thinking, brilliance, generosity, and humility. These are all qualities of heart and mind that I appreciate and admire in Dana Tomlin. And they have been present in the more than 40 years that I've known him. I was reminded of one more quality just before we started when Dana entered the green room, and that's irreverence. But I'll let that go from there. I can't really believe that you are retiring, Dana, and I wish you well in all your future ventures. But I thank you for all that I've learned from you over the years. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne. Our next speaker is Stephen Irvin. Stephen is the Assistant Dean for Information Technology at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and Senior Research Advisor to the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. He teaches and conducts research in the areas of design, computing, media, and technology, with a special interest in landscape modeling and visualization, resilient landscapes, digital fabrication, green buildings, sustainable tourism, and computer-aided design. He is the co-author with my friend and former colleague from the University of Texas at Austin, Hope Hasbrook, of the really important book, Landscape Modeling, Digital Technologies for Landscape Visualization. Stephen is the co-founder of International Digital Landscape Architecture Conference and is a regular contributor and editor of the Journal of Digital Landscape Architecture. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Fritz, for an overly verbose introduction. I feel duly honored to be with this group of people to follow Anne Spirn, as I have tried to do for some time. It's always a great honor for me. I'm going to share a screen here. I was hired in 1989 to teach at the design school, the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, just on the tails of finishing my PhD in urban studies from MIT down the street. And because I was a computer guy in that context, I actually started by meeting Carl Steitz. Carl was at the time teaching a class called Theories and Methods of Landscape Planning, which was a precursor to the third semester design studio for landscape architects, in which he really laid out his argument about defensible processes, what we might today call evidence-based thinking and design. And this was a great opportunity for me as a brand new teacher to see an excellent and experienced teacher as well. Anne's stories about Dana's mentorship in that regard remind me of watching Carl at work in a similar improvisational way. And by the way, it was during the few years that followed that he really worked out his framework for design with the 6 models from representation through to decision. I can actually say I saw a back of the napkin version of this diagram rather early on. And in teaching with the students to continue using computers to make planning decisions, as Anne has described, I felt that there was a kind of a ghost in the hallways wherever I turned, especially in Carl's course, and especially in that context. There was cartographic modeling. There was map algebra. And there was this guy called Dana Tomlin, who at the time I hadn't really met. In passing one time, I think we eventually determined, but he was no longer there. He'd left for Ohio State, and into the vacuum that was created by that leaving, I was sucked by the then chairman, Linda Jewell. But Dana's book was available, and all of the ideas that were important that Carl was trying to describe to the students about thinking through working with data and process models and change models and decision models and so on were well balanced with this technology, which was great for me. But really, my meeting with Dana was through this box of IBM punch cards that was left in the desk that I inherited, in the office that I inherited, which was the Fortran 4 code for the map analysis package. And I knew Fortran. I had come through that in my own training. And I was able to read the cards. And as I recall, I could even get the source code in some other form as well. And really trying to map the ideas that we were teaching in the design, in the studio and in the theories and methods course to these chunks of code and these do loops and these global variables was my way of getting my head around it, because I had not really done anything with GIS or geospatial information. I kind of bluffed my way through that part of the interview at Harvard, as is my wont from time to time. And so I had a lot of learning to do, staying barely ahead of the students for that first several months of that first semester. But the great thing about code is it's very explicit. It's very clear exactly what it's doing. And I was able to, when I first started, compiled and ran this program, I was very confused because I was used to these interactive programs that you would type some commands to it and it would do something. Well, I typed the commands to it, but I couldn't see that it was doing anything. And it took me a couple of days of confusion and going back and reading the code to realize that it was busily dropping file after file after file into the directory every time it created a new map, as is the want of the map algebra, is to continually create new ones as a result of these procedures. So that was really my introduction to this whole world, really, of thinking. And I came to appreciate that from the simplest of the simple, the Cartesian grid, X, Y, 2 by 2, 4 by 4, row by column representation is really brutally simple, which makes it great to compute with. It matches well to computers, even early, especially early ones. And what Dana described in his code and in the book was how these very, very simple atoms could be put together to build increasingly complex models and molecules and life forms, describing complicated 2D, 3D, and even 4D landscape spatial concepts and operations and values zonal operations, very, very complicated and interesting idea. The first I didn't get it the first time I encountered it, and most of our students didn't either. But when you realize the power of this, and then to see examples of actually thinking about processes that are changing. It's one thing to understand a rigid static graphic of a map, a picture, a satellite image perhaps, or a raster grid of some sort. But to see that as only a snapshot of a momentary representation in a living, changing, growing, shrinking, evolving landscape was astonishing to me. And it was really a very powerful way of understanding the deep power of computation and algorithmic thinking in this world. At the time, we had a small lab of a handful, I think a half a dozen of these IBM PC XT computers. They probably had, I don't know, 24 megs of RAM at the very most. And the interface was brutal. It was crude. You typed commands to it. And the graphics were, I'll say, primitive at the time, not just in the map analysis package, but in the entire industry. But it was changing. By the 1990s, there was an explosion. The Apple had now been around for a while, and computing was becoming more graphical. And so one of my first applications, additions to this, was to add color and raster graphics on an IBM PC. This was a time when you had to get a special graphics card and understand about drivers and all kinds of stuff just to be able to do that, and have a mouse so you could actually point to the XY cell on the screen instead of having to type in its coordinates. All of this, by the way, in the PC Scheme variant of Lisp, which was the teaching language at MIT, where I had just come from. And this made access to the brains of the map analysis package in a slightly more convenient way to represent these colored graphics. So we could have colored legends, and we could play with the color maps that were being used to generate them. And generations of Harvard GSD landscape architects, and to some extent architects and urban designs and planners as well, went through the exercise of comparing two approximately similar but specifically different kinds of landscapes. The classic site in Petersham, where Dana's house is in the upper right-hand corner of the map here, and a similarly sized, that being upland woods, and a similarly sized piece of land with a different pattern of transportation on the ocean on Plymouth and the north end of Cape Cod. And working with these, between these two sites, to understand to what extent do common approaches on different sites yield different results, was, I think, very, very valuable, and it was one of the things that's made possible by having this computational machinery. There was also, during that period, the development of some Mac-based GIS implications of the map analysis package, which were also pretty valuable and useful as the PCs aged out and more of our people were using Macintoshes. It was also the time when we were moving from 2D to 3D. So this polytrim system from our friends in Toronto, John Danahy and Rodney Hoinks at the Center for Landscape Research, and my own little program on the Macintosh basis for this kind of 3D generation from data, what we see now in City Engine and other kinds of tools just like that. And I'm dare to say that the proliferation of these kinds of graphics, these maps representing these kinds of thought processes on the surface of the earth at a global scale, such as we've seen in the most recent International Geodesign Collaboration publication, owes all of its graphical, visual, vivid representations to the work that Dana has laid many of the ground foundations for in his time, in his work. I'm happy to say that over the years I've actually got to meet the guy, and I think I can even happily say that we've become friends. I've had the experience of improvising with Dana in front of an audience, which is both a challenge and a thrill. I've got to say that was really quite wonderful. And I'm well aware of the fact that we are now all members of that pantheon of slightly balding, somewhat bearded white males. Thank you so much, Dana, for everything that you did for me, for the world, and my best.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Our next speaker is Karen Sito, the Frederick C. Hickson Professor of Geography and Urbanism at the Yale School of the Environment, a geographer by training. She integrates remote sensing, field interviews, and modeling methods to study urbanization and land change, future land expansion, and the environmental consequences of urbanization at scale. Karen is an expert in satellite remote sensing analysis and has pioneered methods to construct historical land use and to develop empirical models to explain and forecast the expansion of urban areas. She is a coordinating lead author for the Urban Mitigation Chapter of the IPCC United Nations Climate Change 6th Annual Report, currently underway, and the co-lead of the same chapter for the 2014 Fifth Assessment Report. Karen?
Thank you. Well, I will join others in saying that it's really an honor to be here today. I first learned about Dana Tomlin as a graduate student in the early 1990s. I was a doctoral student in a geography department at a time when geography departments had been closed all across the country and were becoming closed. And at that time, Dana was already a revered person in the field. He was already known as the father of map algebra. And I'm glad to see the last presentation that Stephen had with the early years of GIS made me think a lot about how in those early days, when we were working on Sun microsystems, Sun workstations in front of a Unix box and everything was command line. Back in those days, Dana was already really quite a revered person in the GIS and in the geography world. But what I want to do is give a little bit of history of Dana's time at Yale. And I have just a few slides that I want to share. So I hope you can see this. Can folks see that? Okay, so Dana has a long history at Yale, and we are so proud to have him as a Yale graduate, as well as being on our faculty. He arrived at Yale in 1976 as a graduate student, and you can see his thesis, his PhD thesis here, titled Digital Cartographic Modeling Techniques in Environmental Planning. And after Dana left Yale, after he finished his PhD, he left Yale for a few years, but luckily for us, he returned in 1989 to teach GIS, and he has remained on our faculty ever since. He's had an incredible long list of legacies and achievements at Yale, and I want to highlight just two. The first is that Dana has really brought spatial thinking to the entire campus. And I really want to underscore the entire campus. His impact at Yale has been well beyond the School of the Environment. And I should note that we used to be called the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Faculty and students from across campus, the School of Medicine, the School of Architecture, School of Management, across numerous departments through Yale College, including history, urban studies, economics. They all pay tribute to Dana's classes. I am going to guess that Dana's classes have been taken by more students from across campus than any other single class that's offered at Yale. And that's partly based on my conversations with students, but also with faculty. So many faculty across the university speak to Dana's impact on their own work, but also the mentorship that he has offered their students. In many ways, Dana embodies President Salovey's vision of One Yale, of bringing disparate parts of campus together through research and teaching. And so I would say that's certainly one of his biggest legacies here, is bringing this spatial thinking across campus and really uniting the campus in many different ways. His second main legacy here is really his generosity and his mentorship. We've heard that with from the previous speakers. And I want to share a number of stories that I heard from students, from colleagues. So apparently, I didn't have the benefit of taking Dana's classes, but apparently he offers a lifetime warranty. It's an actual ticket that he gives to his students where he promises to answer their GIS questions well beyond the life of the course. And I got copies of some of these warranty cards, which are quite impressive, although I will say that some of these are not lifetime warranties. Some of them only last for 10 years. And some of them only last while supplies last. But nonetheless, his generosity is evident in these gift certificates and warranty certificates that he gives. I want to share this excerpt from an email thread that was on Yale's Geo alumni listserv. Someone posted this question: I am designing an introductory undergraduate course in GIS. Help. This is a former student. A former student responds saying that they have taken 3 of Dana's courses and that they need help in designing additional courses for their classes that they're going to teach. And Dana responds, share freely, no attribution necessary. So he's incredibly generous and not only sharing his classes and his time, but so much of his teaching material. Many students and a number of colleagues say that Dana has shared his time just incredibly generously. One person wrote, "It doesn't matter who's asking for time, whether it's students or an undergraduate student or presenting at the Yale GIS Day or presenting at a newly established conference at a faraway place, Dana's always willing to make the time to advise, to help, or to disseminate his knowledge." He's incredibly generous. When I reached out to our students and asked them for their most memorable moments with Dana, I was blown away with how many of them came back with direct quotes from class, memorized. So many words of wisdom, so many Dana-isms. And I wanted to share just a couple of them. Raster is faster, but raster is vaster, and sometimes vector is just corrector. And another one: when making difficult decisions, do not think of life as a dendritic pattern where choices branch off to infinity. Instead, think of it as a braided river where the meaningful things and choices come back around. One of Dana's students told me, and this is a direct quote, "I think Dana is part Santa Claus and part wizard. He gives you gifts, but he makes you work for them and find your own path. And it sometimes feels like there's a little magic involved in the whole process, bringing together his creativity, curiosity, an elegant way of teaching. As students, we would need to meet the challenge of his riddles that he gave us every week, but it was up to us to figure out how to use them in concert most efficiently and effectively to reach an answer, often using a bit of creativity and ingenuity. And this is another quote, another Dana-ism that a student shared. Don't just push off your past, be pulled by your future. And with that, I'd like to end with just another message, a different message, this time from the dean of our school, Dean Indy Burke.
I wanted to add to the accolades for Dr. Dana Tomlin. He's an alumnus of our school here at Yale, now the Yale School of the Environment. We couldn't be prouder than to claim him as one of our own, as a thought leader in the field of spatial dynamics and a real technological leader in developing algorithms to describe and study spatial dynamics, providing the basis for some of the most advanced software systems in the world to address complex spatial and temporal dynamics. I should say that Dana changed the way I thought about landscape and regional ecology very early on in my career, when I was finishing my postdoc and starting my first faculty position in the late 80s. I think it was through a workshop organized by Harvard Forest LTER for LTER scientists. And he introduced all of us to thinking about spatial relationships, first very simply, then in more and more complex ways, as he described map algebra and introduced us to MAPS, his program, and how to think about spatial dynamics as an ecologist. Dana has long taught here at our school, introducing students to GIS and thinking spatially. I always enjoy reading his evaluations with comments that echo about how I felt about him over 30 years ago. His teaching evaluations ring with enthusiasms. And so I'm just going to read two statements, such as fantastically taught. Professor Tomlin literally designed GIS and is incredibly knowledgeable, approachable, and one of the clearest communicators I have ever met. Or Dr. Tomlin is fascinating to listen to. He explains difficult concepts with an elegance and dramatic flair that is wonderful and rare. I couldn't agree more. So congratulations, Dana, on formally retiring, but please don't stop teaching for us here.
Thank you, Dana, for all your service and time and generosity here at Yale.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. And next we'll hear from Robert Cheatham. Robert is the founder and CEO of Azavera, a B corporation based here in Philadelphia, whose mission is to advance geospatial technology and apply it for civic, social, and environmental impact. The firm develops tools for managing watersheds, climate change, elections, and infrastructure. The firm is also known for its Summer of Maps student fellowship program, open source software, R&D partnerships with universities, and the Open Data Philly initiative. Robert earned his MLA from here at Penn, where he also worked as a software developer and GIS analysis. He also worked for the city of Philadelphia and was a civil servant in Japan. He serves on the advisory board for the Penn State University Masters in GIS and Geodesign, and the Temple University's Professional Science Masters in GIS. Robert?
Thank you for that generous introduction. I was asked to speak a little bit about Dana as a teacher, and I'm going to try to do that, but I also do that recognizing that there are literally thousands of students out there, and I will probably not do anything close to justice in terms of what he's meant to all of those people. I have prepared a few slides though. Can someone tell me if that's showing up?
Yes, it looks great.
Thank you. All right, Dana the teacher. Some of you may have heard this in the news, but the Landsat 9, the 9th Landsat satellite, was launched a couple of days ago, and went back and looked at how many of these. There's obviously been 9 of them, but how far back they go. And the first one was launched back in 1972, almost 50 years ago, and it struck me as I was thinking about what sorts of comments to make that this spans much of Dana's academic career. Landsat has been a revolutionary Earth observation program that's gathered and shared data in an open, transparent way, and given us untold insights about our planet and the places we live in. Imagery and rasters of the topics of much of Dana's work he's recognized for have changed a lot, and in recent years we've seen falling launch costs that are driven by reusable rockets. We've seen the cost of launching payload into space drop exponentially, and miniaturization and mobile phones have meant that Earth observation satellites like Landsat are now launched in flocks of dozens at a time. And there's lots of just amazing things to come in the next several years, higher resolution and faster revisit cadences, and lots of new types of spectral material, and drones are adding to this. This is resulting in just an avalanche of, or many avalanches of raster data, and it's being applied in a lot of amazing ways, from monitoring economies to deforestation, agriculture, and feeding humanity, housing, energy, and even things like medical imagery. And all of these areas, because of Dana's work, pixels and voxels are everywhere, and it feels to me like the world is finally catching up to Dana. It's been a little over 25 years since I first met Dana, and I feel like I'm really still trying to catch up with Dana, not even close. A lot of the lessons I've learned in the time, both as a student and in the years since then, I'm still learning. I thought I might share a few of them. First, lesson number 1, we live in a physical world. While Dana is ostensibly teaching digital tools for use for design and planning and other purposes, it's always rooted in the physical world. 26 years ago, almost to the day, Landsat 6 had recently been launched, but I was in my second year of a landscape architecture program at Penn, and there was what was called a plenary studio. It was a semester in which we had 2 weeks with each member of the faculty in the landscape architecture program, and Dana's class was the first one. I was super excited about this. I knew that Dana taught GIS and computing, and I was really interested in that. And so we're in this computer lab, and the first class was a group activity. He asked us to redesign a doorknob. There were no computers. There was nothing. I don't remember the details of the design task. Dana probably does. But I have come to realize that he thinks deeply about his pedagogy and the specific tools, which are part of what things like ArcGIS or Google Earth Engine are not the point. The exercise, this particular exercise, was around group collaboration and thinking through design as a team, as well as how to approach design problems from another perspective. And Dana really does this a great deal. In order to help students learn a concept, he will leverage examples from the physical world and relate the concepts to lived experience. Many of his students will remember the many faces that show up in things, faces of himself and his family, dogs, the Mona Lisa, even colleagues. And Dana would suggest things like, wouldn't it be great to kick off an advanced satellite imagery research project for NASA from a disconnected cabin in the forests of Maine? And that would be a really terrific idea. And it turned out it was. Second lesson, thinking often starts with a paper and pen. One of the homework assignments that Dana gave, many of them involved manipulating digital data with different types of software. But in this particular one, we had to turn it all in as paper and pencil. And I don't have the exact original one, but this is a reasonable facsimile of the diagram he wanted us to draw by hand on paper, turn it in that form, thinking through a particular sequence of steps that need to happen. I can't tell you how impactful this was. That process of drawing out by hand was one I never forgot, and has influenced my work in the 25 years since then. And I think a lot of others as well, resulting in tools that many of us might use that look like this, and things from companies like Esri that like the model builder tools that look like this. But a lot of it starts with the physical world again. I learned that teaching is also physical, at least it is for Dana. Many teachers use whiteboards, slides, books, and so on. Dana uses not just his voice, but his body. Now, before you start imagining Dana doing interpretive dance to talk about map algebra, it wasn't quite like that, but in one moment he would be standing there explaining something, and then the next he'd be leaping across the room in an unexpectedly animated attempt to show us how changing degrees of friction in a landscape impeded the flow of water, people, and other movement, and how that could be illustrated by moving some chairs or desks around, or standing on something. It looks a bit like this, very animated Dana, but in my memory, it looked a lot like this. It was magical. And at times I have sometimes thought that there were mishaps of students who were trying to replicate things, and they looked like this as well. Another lesson that was really powerful for me, he introduced me to the idea that good things often arise from thinking or working hard on something and then doing other unrelated fun things, that there's a cadence to thinking that intersperses concentrated work with leisure, art, music, food with friends. Mathematicians often speak about the first phase of this as worrying about a problem or an idea. But the lesson was that the key to solving a hard problem is often to take a break from worrying, to move the problem to the back burner, to let an unwatched pot boil. It's a powerful lesson, and one I'm still trying to learn from. Lesson number 5, books are overrated. Dana once confessed to me, and I don't know how many people he's confessed this to, but he's hardly read any books since graduate school. This is kind of a unconventional stance for an academic, so it's probably good I'm bringing this up at the occasion of his retirement rather than his tenure process. But it was a shocking revelation. And don't get me wrong, Dana reads and writes a ton. Student papers, homework, doctoral theses, articles, and tons of other things. But over time, I've come to increasingly think that Dana's got a point, despite being well known for his book. Lesson number 6, generosity wins in the long run. I think this is another example of where the world has caught up with Dana's approach, and referred to this a little bit as well. But before there was something called open source software, and before he even published the book for which he's known, He shared his documentation and his software source code with anyone that asked, and told a great story of what that looked like from a physical perspective. But whether working with fellow academics, scrappy entrepreneurs, large corporations, small companies that later become large companies like Jack Dangerman's firm, or anyone else, this exposes you to the potential for people that take advantage of you, for sure, but sometimes the results may take decades to play out. But today, I think much of the computing ecosystem is built around this idea that fundamental building blocks of technology should be open and shared, and that we can all be more productive and stand on the shoulders of giants as a result. Dana didn't cause all of that to happen, but he did it early and with great generosity, and continued to do so through in all the years since. And I really think he was on the right side of history. And the last lesson is also one that I continue to struggle to learn myself. But when I'm angry or frustrated or faced with a difficult human problem, if I'm fortunate and I'm able to stop, take a breath, and ask myself, what would Dana do? Dana embodies a kind of quiet kindness and humility. It's one that he's extended to me well past my time as a student, and I know I'm not unique in this. And so whether they're now wandering forests, I saw Ross Burnett on the attendees, building global databases of land ownership, working at Esri, protecting watersheds or wildlife diversity. Dana is a mentor and a role model to thousands of students, and on behalf of all of them, I'm deeply grateful. Thank you, Dana.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
Now, please welcome Molly Burnham, the founder and executive director of Goodlands, a social enterprise that assists Catholic communities around the world to realize the potential of their property to support missions of environmental and social justice while improving their financial management. Goodlands digitizes and maps records, including land records, to lay the foundation for evidence-based, community-grounded, design-driven land use. The firm's work includes the Catholic geospatial infrastructure, which supports open access to over 300 data sets, apps, and maps, including global mapping of the Vincenzo family, the global Catholic carbon footprint, a global biodiversity assessment of the Catholic Church, and a green infrastructure assessment of all Catholic-related properties. Molly is also the chief cartographer of the first unified digital map of the Catholic Church. Her work has won numerous awards from the Sierra Club, the United Nations, National Geographic, and others. In many cases, it's the first time these awards have recognized an explicitly faith-based work. Molly?
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I think we can all say it's just an honor to even know Dana at all in the first place. And I'm going to share a couple slides to explain how Dana the teacher really came into my life. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So this is a page from my notebook in graduate school, and you can see it says Dana Tomlin, the king of GIS. This is actually how I was introduced to this person that was going to come and teach us this software the next week. The room that I was introduced to the king of GIS in is this kind of small, homely room on a mountain in Western Connecticut in a school called the Conway School. The Conway School of Landscape Design was founded by landscape architect from the GSD who went on to do his doctorate looking at Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and decided to kind of do something experimental with design education, integrating permaculture and systems thinking. He had no idea where it would go, but this kind of small, strange school in the middle of nowhere essentially was born. And I found this school after I co-founded my first company, a worker-owned cooperative vertical farm, and gotten into the world of sustainable regenerative ag before. And I was shocked by the caliber of the people they brought in and the work of the students. I was very concerned that it might be a bunch of people sitting in a drum circle singing Kumbaya. But there was Dana Tomlin, there was Daryl Morrison, who did Storm King Sculpture Park and also is known for the native plantings in the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. And just a number of Richard Foreman would stop by. And at the time, I don't think I appreciated, to be honest, how magical is just the word for this. The person who introduced me to Dana is right here. This is Paul Hellman, and he had been at the GSD with Dana. And when he introduced us to suitability analyses and map algebra that week, he also introduced us to a framework for geodesign by Carl Steinitz. And earlier in the year, I discovered this book, The Ecological Urbanism Proceedings. And being this kind of do-it-yourself education in some aspects, these two books became almost Bibles for me during this time. Carl Steinitz's geodesign framework was as if somebody older and wiser had taken everything that I had been trying to articulate and put it into words. And when Dana came and taught us GIS, it was one of the best days of my life. I have grown up designing using visual software since even the age of 6 years old. And I would consider my use of it almost like somebody with a prosthetic in some senses, not even as a career. It's a necessary tool for me to interact and understand the world for multiple disciplines. And so when Dana came in and began teaching us, as Rod just said, very animated, it was just an absolutely life-changing experience. And there's me really excited with a lot of coffee, diving in with the software. And I think that's my teammate being somewhat annoyed. And thankfully, I should note, we also had wood stoves in the studio, which is, I don't think that's very common in design schools, but it was very useful in case, we made an ugly map, you could just burn it. And that was kind of the first time I was able to computationally look at over 30,000 properties and to make a habitat model. Reading through Ecological Urbanism Proceedings and a number of other textbooks, it really I became fascinated with even the idea of sinks. So our, pollinator plants that just put random native habitat, what if they're just drawing in little critters without enough sustainable kind of robust habitat needs to actually support them through their life cycle? What if, this paradigm of, say, ecological urbanism or different aspects, how could we tie in more spatial sciences to ground the meta-analyses and work with the practitioners? And I like to think of this as almost bench to garden bedside. The translational capacity of all of this amazing kind of work coming out in public health even, and putting that into our projects. How I went from a school in a barn to presenting a map with Pope Francis and being approved to actually establish a cartography institute there was largely, I would say, influenced by data and completely beyond anything I could have expected. Before Dana and meeting him, I was on path to be a scientific illustrator, which is very much similar to cartography. And my experience was looking at, the body systems and mapping them out. And I remember getting stuck on the endocrine system because I was wondering why there wasn't a paracrine system, because endocrine is based on a kind of signaling. And by mapping the body systems, I started to kind of find a way to understand the body, and then landscape design, planning, landscape architecture, these disciplines and their use of GIS and spatial modeling showed me a way to expand this and to not only impact society and the people we work with, but also to articulate all these complex disciplines we pull together. Dana allowed me to explore using my mind in its kind of own unique operations without, judgment. And how he teaches, asking questions, kind of guiding you down this journey into GIS, and the way that he inspires students and nudges them towards, I would say, challenging themselves with even more difficult problems than they even knew they could take on, is why I, took on something as wild in some senses as the largest non-governmental landholder in the world. Obviously, the other piece of that is that climate change is such a existential crisis that even an idea that wild, I wouldn't, with nobody doing anything about it, I thought it was worth even just trying. I'm so grateful for Dana's impact in my own life, in all the students in the room who were there with me, who have gone in their own directions, and also some of them made useful maps, but maybe not aesthetically stunning, or some of them made beautiful maps that were just very simple. And Dana, I would say, in this very free kind of education setting we had, allowed people to find where they should go next from there. And I am so grateful for his existence as a person and all he's contributed through his innovation and his life. And just thanks so much, Dana. I'm speechless.
Thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you, Molly.
Our final speaker for this part of the program is Jack Dangerman, the founder and president of Environmental Systems Research Institute, a landscape architect by training. Jack founded ISRI as a small research group in 1969 with a vision that computer mapping and analysis could help us all design a better future. ISRI has developed cutting-edge GIS software and geodesign technologies used in every industry, and has organized and ISRI employs more than 4,000 people today worldwide. Jack points out that many who shared his passion for GIS in the early days are still with the company and remain dedicated to helping its users be successful. Jack has been honored by the International Geophysical Union, the International Cartographic Association, the National Geographic Society, the National Audubon Society, and the U.S. Department of State, just to mention a few. He holds honorary doctorates from 13 American and British universities, including the University of Massachusetts, Clark University, the University of Minnesota, and the City College of London. Jack, my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Fritz and Dana. Hello. How are you? If you haven't figured it out, the purpose of this session is to acknowledge you, man. Like, do you feel acknowledged? Yeah, well, I hope so. I think nobody actually knows fully the work that you did to realize this very productive life. Only you really know personally. But the best that we can do is describe our experiences of both you and also the contributions that you've made, and do it in front of your peers so that because only they actually know who you are in their own experiential way. And I mean, it's moving. It should be moving to you, but it's moving to me just to listen to all of the personal experiences shared about you and your life and your sense of purpose. So thank you, Dana. I have assembled a series of notes for myself because there's so much that I'd like to cover, but I'll just hit a few glimmers. My first encounter with you is your paper, actually. You remember Map Algebra 1 Perspective. You wrote in here, it's not the tools or techniques employed, but the answers found and the decisions made that will ultimately measure the merit of, you said, map algebra, and also referred to it and the whole field of GIS. And for me, that was just like one of those moments. Yes, he's got it. The whole purpose of technology has to be kept in mind. Purpose-driven technology, not just technology for its own sake or 3D rotating in real time. It's purpose-driven, and it really reflects your own philosophy and your own life, actually. For everybody listening, I'll say first, Dana was and is a pioneer. And just because you're retiring from Penn, Dana, don't even think about real retirement, right? I know you enough to know that would not be fun for you. Or at least I'm trying to do a guilt trip on you so that you don't stop doing what you're doing. Some of us here have been fortunate to witness the tremendous revolution that's happened in the last 6 decades. And this was driven by some amazing pioneers, Roger Tomlinson, Carl Steinitz, and I really want to say, Dana, that I include you in that cadre of people that contributed to this kind of revolution that's occurring. For the rest of you, I'd just like to highlight a couple of the contributions, and we've heard already from people from their real experience, but one is your pioneering work as a teacher and as an educator. I didn't know about the jumping up on desks or those kinds of acrobatics, but now I'm learning that there's even more depths to you. But you taught people, and for speaking as a professional and working for other GIS professionals, there's nothing more important to the success of GIS than building professionals that really understand not just how the technology works, but the concepts behind it. And this is one of your big contributions. I think second is, Dana, you've been an evangelist and are an evangelist. You not only invented the map algebra, but you talked about it, you spoke about it, you wrote about it, you met with organizations, you interacted with people, and also reflected in your amazing writing. I didn't know about that you don't read books. I'll stop. I'm not losing respect, of course, but it is another dimension that I never knew. Your book, Geographic Information Systems, Cartographic Modeling, has been kind of a textbook that's used by many educators. And also you've traveled a lot and spoke a lot. I mean, you're a long sought after speaker, and I appreciate that about you. You're open to doing it. You're open to discussing and interacting at the personal level. And many of your colleagues have spoke about that, and the humble humility dimensions of your personality have made that possible. And you've also done consulting, small projects, big companies, etc. This is all part of this series of footprints of your work. And then the technology demonstrations, what you've done with students, but also work in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. There's a long series of writings about this, and the kind of funding that you were able to get from National Science Foundation and others that reinforced your work. And then there's, of course, the core thing that you will forever be known about for the development of map algebra itself, this remarkable first principles way to both to get to the fundamentals of map overlays in a digital environment and the interpretation of them. You built on, of course, the work of landscape architecture itself, and it's fitting that there are many landscape architects, students, and professors that are listening. It is a core world that we live in, and in the manual form with people like Ian McCard, who I know inspired you. This whole geodesign concept that Carl worked on later has emerged And then you were influenced by the computerization of maps at Harvard in the lab, and building on the sort of shoulders of others like Ed Horvath and Steinitz and Howard Fisher and Dave Sutton and so on. These were important building blocks. And I'm going through this evolution because I think it really is reflective of what it takes to be someone of your stature. You build on the shoulders of others, as people have mentioned here, and then you continue it on. And you did continue it on at the Harvard with Carl, reinterpreting, rebuilding ImGrid and building it right into this map algebra package that became disseminated so widely. I think, as Robert mentioned, it's worth mentioning your vision of dissemination of the concepts and the technology itself. And having the open source model to get it out has been usually successful in disseminating map algebra, not just for the users of the map package, but more importantly, for people like myself and dozens of other commercial vendors who have taken the concepts of map algebra and embedded it into commercial product shipping and volume. And then a couple words about the impact of all of that. I mean, there are millions of GIS professionals now in the world, professionals, academics, teachers, NGO organizations that are doing science, looking at hydrological modeling, looking at ecological modeling, looking at statistical, geostatistical, all of this building again on the good work that you have contributed. So thank you for all of that. It's worth simply saying that in the world of real world applications, not only have your concepts been applied, but they are also making a difference. Going all the way back to that first quote that I said, which is it's not enough to develop just the theory or the concepts about it or even the methods for it. Ultimately, the true test is whether it really helps people make better decisions and ultimately make the world a better place. So today, looking back on these 25 years, where are we going? It's worth contemplating. Now we have GIS taught in thousands of schools. We're generating new professionals to take this work forward. And certainly the challenges that we are facing of human-induced climate change and overpopulation and the loss of biodiversity is daunting, existential for human beings thinking about a sustainable future. These tools represent a way that we can bring our best science and implement with our best technologies and support our best design thinking to create a more sustainable future. And I think this is going to be the legacy of you, Dana Tomlin. And it will also take thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who can be inspired by the methods of studio teaching that you have pioneered that are upfront and personal and involving, as Molly and Robert really described. This kind of experience is a treasure for your students, and it'll live on and on and on. So thank you personally, Dana. Thank you very much for your work and your contributions. Enough said. I hope you feel acknowledged enough to keep kicking ass at this work.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Jack. Now we're in the Quaker meeting portion of the program. I'd like to open up the floor for anyone's tributes to Dana. Anyone who would like to share a memory or impression, just please post your name in the chat window and I will call on you. And to get this section started, I'd like to call on my colleague Richard Weller, who's our chair of landscape architecture, to say a few words. Richard.
Thank you, Fritz. Can you hear me? Yep, good. I'll do two things very quickly. Firstly, Dana, in my capacity as chair of the department, I want to sincerely thank you for all of your work, and know that it's been appreciated. And also thank you on behalf of all of our students who I think have always been enamored with your teaching, which leads to the second thing, which is just from me to you and others here as a colleague. When I first arrived, I mean, Dana was something of an enigma. He was teaching in the planning department, but he was on the landscape faculty, and then he was also doing work at Yale. So I couldn't quite work out where he fitted. And, you know, the stupid thing to have done would have been to think, oh, he's just the GIS guy and he swings in once a week to teach the students something instrumental. That clearly was not the case with Dana. He started, I mean, when I first arrived, all the other faculty would come into my office and tell me about all the work they're doing. We'd have these long meetings, and Dana, on the other hand, was sort of very laid back, and our interactions were always succinct. And I started to appreciate particularly the way he would sit in faculty meetings looking, either he was wistfully philosophical about what was going on, or he was just incredibly bored. But I did appreciate that very much, Dana. And he would bob up at events and make these enigmatic comments. And then I started to think, maybe this guy's not so sincere, you know, I've got to look into this. What's he up to? And the way to do that, of course, is to look at somebody's teaching evaluations. And that's when the truth of the matter came out. And I learnt from reading Dana's teaching evaluations from our students that, in fact, you know, the students were so enamored with his style, but I realized this was all about substance over style in the case of Dana. The students loved him. They treated him as a guru. And I thought, well, you know, so the essence of this to me is that Dana kind of works in riddles. And I just looked up the definition of riddle, and I think it's pretty close to the mark. A riddle is a question or a statement intentionally phrased so as to require ingenuity in ascertaining its answer or meaning, typically presented as a game. So a riddle is not just, a riddle is really like life itself. And so I think Dana is, when he teaches, he's really teaching about life, not just GIS. And by teaching in riddles and using riddles as a form of pedagogy, he gets students to think. He doesn't just download information and fill them up with knowledge. And this makes our students imaginative. It makes them lateral. And I think ultimately it also makes them humble. And that's something that I think is invaluable. So thank you, Dana, for all that you've done for this department.
Thank you, Richard.
And Lisa Servon, who's the chair of our City and Regional Planning Department.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Dana. The first time I met Dana was during my job interview for my job at Penn. And I'm embarrassed to say that I was one of those people like Anne who had no idea who he was. And for a long time thought he was on our faculty, alluding to something that Richard just said, because he was teaching a lot of our students, and a lot of our students were exclaiming about his wonderful classes. And it was only a few years into my being chair that I realized that we were complete free riders on the landscape architecture program. So you can imagine that when Dana announced that he was retiring and I realized we had no control over who would be hired next, that I panicked a little bit. So I got to know Dana mostly through other people, primarily his students. It's been delightful to hear so many of you speak and introduce me to even more facets of Dana's teaching that I saw through teaching evaluations and speaking to the many planning and MUSA students who took his courses. And of course, through Ken Steiff, who passed away recently, but who was so influenced by Dana and Dana's generosity to keeping that program going and cutting edge. So Dana, you have left a huge hole in our department. I did not get one of those warranties, but I have bugged you since your retirement to ask you questions and help me figure out how to plug those holes that you left. And I am grateful for your continuing generosity, and I really and truly wish you the best.
Thank you, Lisa.
Lisa, Marlon?
Yes, good evening. Good evening, Dana. Good evening, everyone. This is Marlon. I got the pleasure to work with Dana for 7 years at the Cartographic Modeling Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. So when I became aware of this event, I stopped and I started to think, oh, how do you describe Dana? Then my native language is not English. Then I said, I can't think English. I need to think in my native language to come up. How can I describe? What does Dana mean to me? And I started to think in Turkish and French, and that also didn't result in anything. Then to me, Dana is such an incredible person that is so difficult to describe with words. Then I went on Google and I did a search on incredible to come up with multiple different adjectives. I mean, which one shall I use? Again, no luck there. So I finally said to myself, well, the reason why I'm not able to define Dana in my mind, it's because you really need to live him. And that may sound very cliche to many, but that's what I really feel. You need to live him by attending his class or his lecture, by being present in the same room. I've attended so many staff meetings with him, by listening him speaking, by just being at his presence. So that is what I came up with. And then, so I moved on from the CML and I joined an engineering consulting firm. And of course, I ran into issues, technical issues, raster modeling. How do I do it? How do I represent it the best? I reach out to Dana. Dana, please help me. And of course, he's there for me. Then I moved on to local government. Dana, how do I bring order to this GIS world of the local government? Dana is there to help me. So he's always been there to help. I've always thought that, I always have a subject matter expert to go to and ask and get his input. I've never met in my 25 years of career, I've never met such a generous, incredible, and brilliant person. So Dana, I want to say thank you to you for enabling me to dream in GIS, for enabling me to think out of the box, for always being there for me every single time. Maybe you are retiring, but that doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Yes, you won't be able, although I do have ideas of how you can carry on your knowledge to generations to come, and I will, email you about that separately, but for me, you will always be there. So thank you. Thank you so much for everything, Dana.
Thank you, Marlon.
And Eric?
Thank you, Fritz. Thank you, Dana. First, I just wanted to say that I'm really going to miss your quiet, thoughtful comments in faculty meetings. And the second thing, I really want to thank you for the I would say almost complete and utter atrophying of my ability to use GIS. I think probably the last 4 times I've tried to open ArcGIS, my license has been expired. The last few times I've tried to use QGIS, I've found that I've got about 30 to 45 minutes of downloads before I can even begin to open the program. And the reason is just you've trained our students so fabulously well. They're all so much better at doing anything that I might do. And just working with them has been amazing. It's been an amazing opportunity being here at Penn for the last 8 years, being able to benefit from your teaching. And as an advisor, it's also been really terrific. I love when I talk to my advisees and they tell me how excited they are to take a class with you. I love that I can sit with them and recommend taking your courses, because I know based on the experience of other students how much they're going to get out of it and how much they'll love it. So just wanted to say thank you and congratulations.
Thanks, Ari.
And next Raina.
Hi, Dana. I wanted to start with probably one of my favorite memories of learning from Dana, which is when I was taking his modeling geographic space class. You were teaching us about like a particular algorithm or model. And of course, I can't remember what it was anymore, but you sort of made this side comment where you sort of mentioned that you had written that algorithm for your wife when you were a graduate student. And it was just a sort of great little aside that you said, but for me, it really brought home that I was being taught by someone who had created and really shaped the field so much. And you also just said it with just so much just a joy and appreciation for the field that that's something that's really stuck with me. And I didn't know you or your reputation before I took my first GIS class, especially since at Penn I was a historic preservation student. But I ended up after that class just taking as many GIS courses as I could without endangering my ability to graduate and without driving my actual advisors too crazy. But you know, your generosity and kindness throughout my time at Penn is just something that really sticks with me. For my thesis, even though it was again supposed to be a historic preservation thesis, you really became my informal advisor, since I really sort of ended up making it a GIS thesis topic. And I had to laugh because when Karen mentioned the coupons, I kind of went and looked mine up because I was curious. I remembered getting one from you when I graduated. And it says that it's good for 10,000 questions. And I'm probably close to my 10,000 limit because I think I started asking you questions almost immediately when I graduated. And in the 7 years since, I've continued to pester you. And as others have said, your generosity and your kindness and your just your willingness to be a mentor and a teacher to me, both when I was at Penn and since then, is something that I really treasure. And it's definitely shaped how I now approach my work and how I teach when I get to work with students in my job today. So I just wanted to say thank you for everything.
Thank you, Raina.
Thank you. Matthew, and by the way, there's, Dana, I don't know if you're looking at the chat, but it's filling up with comments from everyone. And Matthew was next who requested to speak. If anybody else wants to, I've got Krista next, and we'll keep working through the list.
Well, sure. Maybe to that point, the Dana Tomlin that I know is probably much too modest to sort of want all these accolades piled on him. So I guess there's a big thanks from all of us for Dana for letting us do this for you today. A bunch of years ago, several years after I had left Penn, I found myself driving through central Massachusetts and somehow recognized Petersham from probably from all the maps that I'd spent sort of poring over in Dana's classes on. So I ended up sort of getting to pull over and visit with Dana and Sam and their son Matson for a while. And while we were sort of hanging out at the house there, Dana sort of pointed out this piece of sound equipment that was sort of piled in the corner, just sitting on a table. And he mentioned to me that he had purchased it sort of several years earlier for his son Matson, who was then 12 or 13 years old. And I said, well, what is it? He goes, well, it's just it's this complicated sort of thing for recording sound in a certain way for use in movie making. And if you know anything about Dana's son, he's sort of at the launch of his own sort of remarkably sort of fast-growing career right now. But he said, I purchased it a bunch of years earlier and I just put it over here on this table, knowing that Matson would eventually find it and use it to incredible purpose. And at that moment, I realized, well, that's what Dana had been doing for all of us in all of the courses that he was teaching. He wasn't, as some professors were, he wasn't trying to teach us the what and the how and trying to mold us in his image. He was presenting us with the tools, the ways of thinking that we could essentially make ourselves and to enable us to become the practitioners or even the humans that we would eventually be. And I always sort of appreciated that far beyond the incredible sort of work I got to do in GIS and urban design and planning. But it was really the way that that Dana sort of helped me become the person that I am, and I'm assuming he helped many of you in similar ways. So thank you, Dana.
Thank you, Matt.
And Krista?
Oh, thanks. That was just actually to add my gratitude as an alumni of both Penn and the Cartographic Modeling Lab. Dana's work definitely helped mold a lot of the work that I continued to do, including getting my brain to sort of figure out how to apply things like sine and cosine into raster analysis. And so it was Dana, you were always the best exercise for my brain every time. I've also been an occasional GIS instructor. And, you know, again, those teaching aspects have filtered through. So as I'm sure you know, your work has been exponential. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista.
So if anyone else would like to say something, you're welcome. If not, I'm going to put Dana on the spot and see if he would like to say a few words.
I would.
We've got, I'm sorry, we've got Parvin Matter is on, has asked to say something.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. I recall that I arrived at Penn for the Penn Musa program, and I picked Dana for my capstone. The only thing I will say is that, you know, I describe him as the shepherd. He gave me full liberty to do whatever I wanted, and he nudged me in the right direction, helped me, guided me, and so you know, his magnanimity and his guidance is what I think helps me even today, every day. And I also want to say, Dana, thank you so much. I have kept every single handout of yours from those classes, and I think that's probably one of my go-to resource anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Praveen.
So Dana, turn it over to you if you would like to say a few words.
I would. So this has been considerably less painful than I had anticipated. But rather than continue to look over our shoulders, I'd like to talk about the near future. I can speak with authority only to my own near future. So let me tell you what's going to happen. In a few moments, we're all going to go offline, and I'm going to sit down with my silent partner in this enterprise. Our partnership is one that dates back to high school. It's been official now for almost 5 decades. And as long as I let her remain off stage, our meeting is likely to be a lot more pleasant than it would be otherwise. In any event, tomorrow morning, we'll get up early. We have both canine and feline alarm clocks that will reliably wake us at 5. And the first thing Sam will do is to check on the homemade relish that we've been canning for the past few days. This is an enterprise in which I am the silent partner. Soon after that, she'll pack my lunch, and I'll set off on what now seems like a modest commute of only 2 hours in order to spend another few hours espousing the virtues of things like autocomplete Polygon. On Friday morning, we will pack up our bikes and head off to northern Maine. Our destination will be a remote cabin that we've been hand building for several decades now. Let me say that again, hand building for several decades now. This is where I did a lot of my early writing, and it's where my son has spent the past month doing a lot of what will become his early writing. I was writing about GIS. He's writing about something that is equally satisfying. And when you learn what it is, you'll understand why I say this. Jack spoke of a legacy. I can assure you that Sam and I will ultimately be remembered not so much as GIS guys, but as the parents of Weitzman Tomlin. And that feels great. Thanks again, guys. Have a good evening. Stay in touch.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for everyone who spoke, and have a good evening. Dana, you've touched many, and we are in your gratitude. Good night and stay well all.